Why is Gachiakuta better than Soul Eater? Series creator Kei Urana worked for Ohkubo, but she took his style of storytelling and drawing and just made it better, which is hard to come out and say since so many people love Soul Eater, but a lot of people who love Soul Eater will tell you that they prefer Gachiakuta. But that does create an important question. If Kei Urana worked so closely to Ohkubo for so long, how was she able to make his style any better? Like, what is so different about her style? So in this video, I'd like to compare Soul Eater and Gachiakuta, discuss how Kei Urana borrows a lot from Ohkubo, but also explain why she has one of the most creative styles in the entire industry. Now, before I get into that, I already know what you're thinking. Soul Eater is a complete story and Gachiakuta is not, so there's no way to compare the two. Well, actually, yes there is. Gachiakuta may not be complete, but it's a few years old now, and considering it'll probably be 300 to 350 chapters long, it's about 40% done. Basically, the manga has been around long enough to be compared to series like Soul Eater, Fire Force, or any of the big three for that matter. The idea that you can't compare a shorter series to a longer series is pretty silly if you ask me, but that's a rant for another day. Anyway, speaking of Fire Force, I'm mostly focusing on Soul Eater here because even though Urana worked on Fire Force and not Soul Eater, 90% of what I say about Soul Eater applies to Fire Force as well. So first, let's talk about why Soul Eater and Gachiakuta are so similar, because if you bring up this discussion, you will immediately get people who try to say that they're completely different, and that's just not true. Urana worked as an assistant to Ohkubo, so whether you want to admit it or not, she's clearly influenced by his work. They both love to draw crazy looking characters. They both have unhinged art styles. They both like to incorporate graffiti art into their stories. They both know how to come up with very simple but really fun power systems. And they're generally both silly people that love to contrast serious storytelling with memes and comedy. So really they have more in common than they do things that make them different. That being said, that's why I want to talk about why Kei Urana is slightly better. So first let's talk about the thing that stands out right away, the art style. I've done a video on Ohkubo's art style, 2 actually, and I've done a video on Kei Urana's art style. What stands out about both of them is crazy designs and unhinged expression. So for example, all of the characters in Soul Eater are crazy looking. Stein is a literal Frankenstein, Kid has his weird haircut, Black Star has hair that is more spike and less hair, and the same is true for the designs in Gachiakuta. Rio has a bizarre hairstyle, Engine has that slick haircut and a ton of tattoos, and then of course you have a guy like Jabber who is the definition of crazy. So it's easy to see why people who like the characters in Soul Eater also like the characters in Gachiakuta. But now that I've read Gachiakuta like 3 times, I can honestly say I like Urana's approach to character designs better. And it really comes down to detail, which is going to be a big theme in this video. Actually, real quick, before I get into that, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video. You'll get custom badges and emojis to show off during our weekly live streams, and you can pick which series I cover next. So let's compare Kid and Rudo. So on the one hand, Kid has kind of a wacky design. He's got the weird haircut and he's got his fancy suit. Plus, if you add his guns, he even holds them funny. But his overall design is so simple that it's basically a cartoon. His suit is practically all one shape, minus the white rectangles, and his hair sits flat on his head. This is generally true for all of Ohkubo's character designs. His characters are mostly simple, but he adds a few crazy features to make them stand out. In fact, a lot of the wackiness comes from the art style, not the actual designs of the characters. But it's completely different when you look at Gachiakuta. If you look at Rudo's first design, it's really not that crazy. It's just Rudo in this big overall suit with big old gloves. He's got red eyes and spiky hair, but that's not that weird in anime. At the same time, his clothes are super detailed with all of these like scratches and wrinkles and pockets. Compared to Kid's flat suit, it's like night and day. Really, the biggest difference between Soul Eater characters and Gachiakuta characters is layers. Ohkubo starts simple and adds a few quirks. Urana starts simple, but then adds a bunch of quirks and then gives each character a crazy outfit and then layers that outfit with plenty of detail. You can see this with Rio as well. Rio is fairly normal looking on her own, but she's got that funny way she puts up her hair. On top of that, she has her crazy outfit consisting of thigh-high boots, small shorts, a big belt, and then a waist-cut overcoat. Even a plain character like Zonka has a crazy outfit. Ironically, Urana's approach to character designs is almost like the power system. It starts simple, like a regular umbrella or scissors, but then once you add these layers, it immediately stands out as something completely on its own. But what's even more impressive about the art in Gachiakuta is how insanely detailed it is every week. See, one might assume that because Ohkubo has more experience that his art is naturally better. But if you didn't know who was who, you'd probably think Urana was the better artist because Gachiakuta is just way more detailed. Both artists go for a cartoonish style, but Ohkubo keeps it really simple, while Urana adds a ton of detail in the characters and backgrounds. And the best part about it is that Gachiakuta is weekly while Soul Eater was monthly. That's right, Soul Eater was on a monthly schedule, so there's really no excuse. To that point, you might say, oh, well, Ohkubo was a new artist, so it's not that fair to say that, which is totally true, but then what is Kei Urana? Urana started out with Gachiakuta in a weekly manga, and every week each chapter is fully detailed. The characters are full of detail, the scenery is full of detail, even the paneling is a bit more nuanced than the paneling of Soul Eater. Now, another argument you might bring up is that more detail doesn't mean better art. In other words, it's a matter of style, so it's subjective, which is true. Just because you make a manga more detailed doesn't mean it's necessarily better than something like Dragon Ball. But something that goes underappreciated is manga that stay this detailed on a weekly schedule and never have to adapt. Like, it's real easy for a new manga to start and have this crazy art style, but after about 70 chapters or so, you almost always see the art in those mangas start to get toned down somehow. Classic example, Jujutsu Kaisen. Jujutsu Kaisen had insane art for a while, but then after Shibuya, we saw what was clearly a drop in consistency. The simple reason is that it's just hard to stay that consistent every week for 5, 6, or even 7 years. That's why artists like Horikoshi are kind of genius. My Hero achieves this amazing balance of simple looking characters with crazy outfits and details. As far as I can remember, Horikoshi didn't take an unusual amount of breaks, which is another thing to keep in mind. But someone who almost never takes breaks is Yukinobu Tatsu, the creator of Dandadan. Dandadan is another manga that is very similar to Gachiakuta in the sense that the level of detail you see in every chapter seems almost superhuman. Granted, Tatsu will go on break for research, but even then, it's like 3 times a year tops. It's for that reason that, if you ask me, I would argue Dandadan and Gachiakuta are the 2 manga tied for the #1 ongoing series, which is a pretty bold claim, and I'm sure you're thinking, okay, well, Gachiakuta has great art, but it's still a relatively new series. But to the contrary, after 130 chapters, Gachiakuta has already done something that Soul Eater could never do. It has a story that consistently gets better and better. Now, don't get me wrong, Soul Eater is one of my all-time favorite manga, like top 10 at least. But one of my biggest criticisms of that story is that it's got its peaks and its valleys. And this is actually where I'll throw Fire Force into the ring as well. See, Fire Force is the kind of story that starts out sort of a slow burn, but then builds up fast and just never stops. That is not the case with Soul Eater. Whereas I didn't like the early arcs of Fire Force as much, I still think Soul Eater has one of the best first arcs ever. The way you build up to the fight against Medusa and then you get the Ashura reveal is incredible. But after that arc, the pacing is a bit all over the place. Not bad, just inconsistent. It isn't until you get to the Baba Yaga arc where you reach a high that's even better than the fight against Medusa. But everything in between just feels like Ohkubo is taking things one arc at a time. Meanwhile, this could not be more untrue about Gachiakuta. This is the one area where Gachiakuta Gachiakuta feels like Fire Force, namely the way it starts out slow and takes the time to carefully build the world and the plot. The first 30 chapters are basically just Rudo fighting trash beasts before the fight against Jabber. But in that time, you learn about the differences between the sphere and the ground. You learn about the cleaners and the raiders. And Urana also slowly fleshes out the power system. But after that fight with Jabber, everything picks up fast. It's only 70 chapters in when you meet Zodil and you get the big fight of his team against Engin's team. And at this point, there's such a better sense of mystery in the plot than there ever was in Soul Eater. That's partly why the pacing in Soul Eater feels inconsistent. There is a central plot, obviously, but for the most part, there is no big mystery. It wasn't until Fire Force that we got anything like that. And in Gachiakuta, the mystery is like half the reason to read the story. Urana achieves this perfect balance of carefully revealing information to readers while adding crazy twists every step of the way to the point where the plot is always growing, but you literally never see it coming. It's more consistent than the plot in Soul Eater, and you could even argue that it's better than the plot in Fire Force. Above all else, I think this is the strongest case for saying Gachiakuta is better than Soul Eater. So at this point, I've talked about the plot and I've talked about the art, but you're probably still wondering what's the difference. Like, sure, Gachiakuta is more detailed, but that doesn't make it objectively better than the simple style of Soul Eater. And it might have this carefully crafted plot, but plenty of people like Soul Eater over Fire Force, so that doesn't make the writing any better. So what's so special about Kei Urana that makes Gachiakuta even remotely better than Soul Eater, or Fire Force for that matter? And while I still appreciate that it comes down to personal preference, it just seems like Kei Urana is a bit more unconventional than Ohkubo. Don't get me wrong, when it comes to manga, Ohkubo is easily one of the most creative artists. The way he expresses emotions with his characters, the way he warps perspectives and backgrounds, the goofy art style, but Urana does a lot of that same stuff. And when it comes to the story, there's a lot of stuff that you just don't see in other shonen manga. As much as I think Soul Eater is special, I also think it's very much a classic shonen story, meaning that it's got all the same tropes as other series like Fairy Tail or Black Clover or whatever. Gachiakuta also has tropes, but it also does a lot of things that you rarely see. Like in the fight against Zodil that I mentioned, there's only like 2 real fights. There's supposed to be like 3 other fights, but they all kind of take a big left turn. Urana also likes to write arcs where there are no fights and it's all about the characters. Like in one arc, they go to Canvas Town and we learn all about the spellcasters. In that arc, there are no fights. It's really just about Rudo meeting Remlin. Granted, it's a short arc, but it fleshes out the world and the characters. We get a very similar situation when Rudo and Remlin go on a field trip. It's only a couple of chapters, but it's a great moment for building the character dynamics. On top of that, Urana goes to some really dark places that you rarely see in classic shonen. Basically anything involving Amo is heavy, and I mean seriously tragic backstory heavy. It's great because while Gachiakuta is still a very silly story, it also takes some dark turns that round out the story and give it a lot of substance. So for these reasons, I do have to pay respect to Urana and her ability to really push the limits of the shonen formula. Because of that, and everything we talked about before, I do think Gachiakuta is slightly better than Soul Eater. But that's if you put a gun to my head. And even then, it kind of depends on what mood you catch me in. Because while I think the writing is generally better in Gachiakuta, it's a similar situation to Fire Force where I still find myself liking the characters in Soul Eater more. Part of that is because of the different approaches to characters. With Oukubo, you know what a character is all about. Soul and Maka want to collect 100 souls. Black Star wants to transcend the gods. Kid wants perfection. But Urana doesn't really spell out motivations. In fact, she often hides them. Like, we don't really know what Rio is about. We know Zonka's motivation, but we don't get the full extent until 70 chapters into the story. And at this point, we still don't really know anything about Engine. Urana is more about building characters through interaction interactions and personalities. Which, let's be clear, Soul Eater has tons of personality, and Ohkubo is just as big on character interactions. But I think part of the reason I like the characters in Soul Eater more is because Ohkubo makes it easier to invest in them right away. Urana makes great characters, but she kinda plays the long game. Another reason is simply because I've known Soul Eater longer, and Gachiakuta is still running. So part of it is just bias, which is honestly the core of this discussion. As much as I try to be objective, there is no right or wrong answer. It basically comes down to preference. But at the same time, for anyone who reads a lot of these ongoing series and has read a lot of classic shonen manga, there's a bunch of reasons why Gachiakuta has been praised as the next big manga for years. The art style is great and the level of detail seems impossible. The story and the plot are unlike any other, and Urana has an incredible sense of personality that shines through in every chapter. For those reasons, while I still love Soul Eater, I do think Gachiakuta has finally surpassed its predecessors. But maybe I'm wrong. Which manga do you prefer? How would you describe Urana's style? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to think down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get custom badges and emojis, you can pick which series I cover next, and you can even get credited in my next video. Also check out my other Gachiakuta videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.